is a problem most organizations have faced at one point or another, having to deal with a rogue member. But while it's tricky enough when that member is a person, it's a whole other ballgame when they're a nation state. One that's gone rogue within the framework of the world's most powerful military alliance. A nation state like Hungary. A small Central European country of around 10 million, Hungary has the good fortune to sit at the head table of two organizations that require unanimity on key decisions: the European Union and NATO. In peacetime, this setup has given Prime Minister Viktor Orban the ability to frustrate his allies. In wartime, though, it's handed him the ability to hold the entire Western alliance hostage. Over the last 2 years, Budapest has slow-walked Sweden's application to join NATO, blocked urgent aid to Ukraine, and cozied up to China, all in direct opposition to the interests of its allies. Is it time to consider the unthinkable? To consider ejecting Hungary from NATO? Well, we've looked at the arguments and practicalities to show you how such a momentous decision could impact everyone involved. Before we get to the meat of this video, there's one thing that we do need to make absolutely clear. It is not legally possible for NATO to kick out a misbehaving member. Over the last decade, people have repeatedly suggested members such as Turkey get the boot for things as varied as buying Russian S-400 air defense systems or launching an invasion of northern Syria. Each time, the demands to expel Ankara hit the same stumbling block. It can't legally be done. Here's NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg explaining the issue in 2021. NATO doesn't have any mechanism to expel members, and I will not recommend that to be introduced in our founding treaty. Because NATO operates on the principle of unanimity, every member has an absolute veto on treaty changes. That means even creating a mechanism for kicking out wayward allies in the future is impossible, since renegades like Hungary and Turkey would veto it. Nor is NATO like the EU, which can't kick members out, but at least has Article 7, which allows for the suspension of states' voting rights in extreme circumstances. As Just Security put it, the founding instruments of many international organizations provide for the suspension of a member state's rights. Alas, the North Atlantic Treaty is not among them. No provision in the treaty foresees the suspension of membership rights, let alone the expulsion of an ally. So, we guess that's it then. If it's not possible to expel Hungary from NATO, then our question is answered, and we might as well just roll the credits now. Thanks for watching, have a nice lunch. Except, of course, you already know that we're not going to do that. You can see how long this video is. No, while kicking Hungary out of NATO may be impossible, we didn't make a video just to explore legal niceties here. Rather, we're using the concept of expulsion as a springboard for a wider overview of Budapest's relationship with its allies. How we got to this weird place where Orban seems to be picking fights with his friends, and what strategic implications that has for the entire West. Because, make no mistake, with Orban willing to wield his veto over multiple policies, the danger is fast becoming that the entire transatlantic alliance could be derailed by one man. One man overseeing a nation with a population barely that of Michigan and an economy smaller than Algeria. It didn't have to be this way, though. Back in 1948, as discussions on founding NATO were underway, Canada proposed including an expulsion clause. But the other states were all like, oh, Canada, what could we possibly use that for? Well, 75 years later, that answer's pretty obvious. As the EU has likewise discovered, while unanimity is workable when you have 11 or 12 members, each new addition increases the likelihood of someone using their veto for personal gain, out of spite, or because they're in hock to a foreign power. And while we may not know exactly what is driving Orban, we can already see how his willingness to wield Hungary's veto has had damaging impacts. If you're looking for a single issue that demonstrates Hungary's determination to screw with its NATO allies, look no further than the admissions process for Finland and Sweden. On May the 18th, 2022, the two historically non-aligned Nordic countries handed in their joint application, their decision sparked by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Since both nations already worked closely with the alliance, it was hoped their accession would be a mere formality, something that could be neatly tied up by the end of 2022. Nearly 2 years later, the loose end of Sweden's membership still remains resolutely untied. Across the whole of 2022 and early 2023, the other 28 members of NATO were forced to wait on the glacially slow decisions of Hungary and Turkey. In Budapest, Orban's ruling Fidesz party repeatedly delayed votes, claiming it was busy with other matters. It wasn't until mid-March of 2023 that President Erdogan dropped Turkey's objections to Finland joining, at which point Hungary agreed to likewise let Helsinki into the club. Sweden, though, that was another matter. At the time of writing in mid-January 2024, Stockholm is still waiting for the all-clear from Ankara and Budapest. The Hungarian government, meanwhile, seems to be relishing its chance to stick it to a country that has frequently criticized Budapest's democratic backsliding. Back in fall, President Katalin Novak noted how Sweden is or has been quite vocal in condemning the functioning of our parliament or stated a lack of democracy in our country. Of course, Hungary isn't alone in holding up Stockholm's application. Turkey is also dragging the process out. The difference is, the wider NATO alliance is pretty sure it knows why Erdogan is being difficult. He wants certain Kurds living in Sweden to be extradited to Turkey, and he wants to get his hands on American fighter jets. Orban, by contrast, doesn't seem to have a clear goal in mind. Speaking anonymously to Politico, one diplomat bemoaned the Hungarian Prime Minister's veto threat as an annoying sideshow. That's not to say there's not any logic to it. The best anyone can figure out, Orban is following Erdogan's lead as a way to cozy up to the Turkish president. Politico described a conversation with a Hungarian official, quote, "When it comes to NATO accession, Hungary's position is fundamentally shaped by the preferences of Turkey," the Hungarian official said. If Ankara's position changes, this person added, this changes the Hungarian position. The idea is that Orban sees in Erdogan someone like him, an elected autocrat who is weakening democracy while out for the interests of his own ethnicity. Someone it could be useful to forge a closer bond with. The issue, of course, is that this bond is coming at the expense of Europe's safety. On January the 10th this year, Sweden's civil defense minister warned that a war with Russia could be coming. As it stands, the Swedish island of Gotland is seen as one of the continent's weak points, somewhere outside of NATO protection that Russia might try to quickly seize in a wider conflict. For NATO's other 29 members, these are not things Budapest should be playing around with, especially not at a time when Vladimir Putin seems to be increasingly confident he can prevail in Ukraine. But then, it seems likely the Hungarian leader already knows that, because the other major gripe about Orban isn't just that he's getting close to fellow autocrats within NATO like Erdogan, but autocrats outside the alliance too. Specifically, with two autocrats that, together, the majority of NATO see as their greatest threats. We're of course talking about Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. In October 2023, the wider Western alliance was treated to the awkward sight of one of its own taking part in what we can only call an authoritarian love-in. The venue was the Third Belt and Road Initiative Forum in Beijing, an event that was almost uniformly ignored by NATO members. While leaders from Italy, Greece, and the Czech Republic had attended both the 2017 and 2019 editions, with more NATO leaders going to at least one, this year there was only one head of an alliance country in attendance. But rather than cut a lonely figure on the Chinese stage, Viktor Orban instead used his appearance to butter up world leaders that his allies consider foes. That included becoming the first Western leader to meet Putin since April 2022, a meeting where Orban used the Russian autocrat's preferred euphemism for the Ukraine war, a special military operation, and swore to Putin to, quote, "Hungary never wanted to confront Russia." As the BBC reported at the time, the sight of an EU and NATO leader shaking hands with Vladimir Putin angered Mr. Orban's Western allies. The US ambassador to Budapest complained that while Russia was striking Ukrainian civilians, Hungary pleads for business deals. Elsewhere in the summit, Orban repeated the same trick with Xi Jinping. Telling the Chinese leader that relations between their countries had reached unprecedented heights, Orban also issued a thinly veiled swipe at America, claiming that Hungary shall not accept any kind of external ideological pressure and would follow its national interests in doing business with China. The jab comes at a time when the US is leaning heavily on its allies to decouple from China, or at least de-risk their supply chains. at a time when Europe too is beginning to grow increasingly wary of Beijing's assertiveness. So it's a little odd to watch Viktor Orban dancing not just to a different tune, but to a whole different genre of music, one made from a funky mashup of political opportunism and a diss track directed at his own allies. From a Hungarian nationalist perspective, of course, Orban's dictator Lovin made perfect sense. Despite the cutoff to most of Europe, Hungary continues to receive cheap gas from Russia and has contracted state company Rosatom to build a nuclear power plant. China, meanwhile, rewarded Orban's visit with electric vehicle investments. This is something we want to emphasize across this video. Orban is rarely doing these things for the sheer, unadulterated hell of it. He's doing them because he perceives them as being beneficial to Hungary. And frankly, it's not really our place to disagree. What we can and will question, though, is why Budapest feels it can have its cake and eat it too. Why Orban seems happy to rely on NATO's nuclear umbrella to protect his nation while also taking actions that are directly contrary to US and EU interests. Because let's be really clear here, Hungary needs NATO more than NATO needs Hungary. If Orban really disagreed with the alliance's stance on things, he could always head for the exit door. That he doesn't demonstrates the value that he sees in its mutual defense clause. Not that NATO is the only organization the Hungarian leader has been wielding his veto over to devastating effects. Where the Ukraine war is concerned, Budapest seems determined to single-handedly destroy any show of unity within the European Union. From a narrow perspective, you could argue that Hungary has done its part assisting Ukraine over the past couple of years. Despite being internationally famous for his anti-refugee positions, Orban allowed 25,000 people fleeing the war to remain in Hungary, while hundreds of thousands more were able to cross Hungarian territory to reach other European countries. The government in Budapest has also provided humanitarian aid to the conflict zone and joined the rest of the EU in placing sanctions on Russia, albeit with exceptions that allow Hungary to keep importing oil and gas. From the perspective of much of NATO, though, Budapest hasn't done nearly enough. Military aid to Kiev, for example, isn't allowed to cross Hungarian soil, and the government has blocked the EU from placing sanctions on key Russian officials. Given that the alliance's stated aim is to pressure Moscow into withdrawing its forces from Ukraine, this has caused considerable frustration, especially in countries like Poland and the Baltics that reasonably worry that they might be next on the Kremlin's hit list. But perhaps nothing has chafed quite so much as the way Hungary has used EU rules to veto money Ukraine desperately needs to remain a functioning state. Back on December the 14th, Orban blocked a $55 billion package intended to keep the government in Kiev solvent through 2027. As the Washington Post noted, that included money for everything from servicing debts to paying soldiers' salaries. Orban's stated rationale was the aid was a waste of Hungarian taxpayers' money. To many others, though, it looked less like the Prime Minister was looking out for working Hungarians and more like he was trying to blackmail the rest of the EU. For over a year now, Budapest and Brussels have been in a standoff over billions in funds from the EU's structural and COVID recovery programs. In December 2022, Brussels froze the funds over concerns that Hungary was undermining the independence of its judiciary and failing to safeguard against graft and corruption. The steps Budapest needs to take to unblock these funds are supposed to be a completely separate process to any aid for Ukraine. The reality is, though, that this has become a bargaining chip. On the 13th of December, the EU unexpectedly unlocked 10 billion euros for Budapest, a move the European Commission claimed was a reward for Hungary meeting certain milestones. And we say claimed there because there was a lot of cynicism that the funds were released as a bribe. Cynicism that seemed to prove founded just a day later when Orban left a meeting on opening accession talks with Ukraine rather than veto them. In The Economist's words, quote, perhaps not coincidentally, a 10 billion euro slug of EU funds destined for Hungary that had been suspended over its deficient judiciary was released earlier this week. Mr. Orban absented himself from the European Council room at the moment of the vote on opening formal admission talks with Ukraine, thus tacitly acquiescing to the move. The quote ends. But while opening membership talks was great for Ukrainian morale, the vetoing of much-needed aid was seen as delivering a mafia-style message to Brussels. Pay up or Ukraine starves. Or as the New York Times put it, quote, critics have said Hungary's objections to Ukraine's long-term funding are best understood as an effort by Mr. Orban to extract EU funds. By the time you see this, it's possible that Orban could have dropped his veto. EU leaders are meant to meet on February the 1st to try and find common ground. According to Bloomberg, Italy's nationalist populist leader, Giorgia Meloni, is spending the time before then working to convince Orban to drop his veto. Coming from a politician Orban considers an ideological bedfellow on most other issues, her intervention may yet work. And even if it doesn't, Ukraine funding won't simply dry up. Although EU leaders want to project unanimity, there are mechanisms by which the remaining 26 states could club together to provide Kyiv an economic lifeline without Hungarian involvement. So the point here isn't to suggest that Orban alone could collapse the entire Western effort to support Ukraine. Rather, it's to show how misaligned Hungarian strategic goals are becoming from those of the wider alliance. For the majority of NATO governments, halting Russian expansionism is a key security priority. For some, like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, it is an existential issue. By playing games, Orban is undermining the alliance's stability and unity just when it needs it most. Honestly, it does seem more than a little absurd that a country of just 10 million people can stop the EU acting in the interests of its other 438 million citizens. A little like if tiny Rhode Island had the ability to constantly veto US foreign policy. But perhaps a more pertinent question is why? Why has Budapest chosen Ukraine as the issue to play games with? Well, partly, the answer is probably because it's high pressure. Orban knows that EU leaders are aware of time constraints to finance Kyiv and judges that they'll blink first. But it's partly also something deeper, something that ties into the fractious relationship Orban has developed with Ukraine itself. Not so long ago, Hungary was one of Ukraine's best friends in Europe. Because of a large Hungarian minority in the border region of Transcarpathia, Budapest was keen to support development projects. By 2020, The Economist reports that Hungary had given over $264 million in aid to Ukraine's westernmost province. Unfortunately, what had once been the basis for a good relationship between the countries would soon become the very thing that drove them apart. Under Orban, Hungary has come to hardcore embrace nostalgia for Greater Hungary, the full extent of territory Budapest controlled prior to World War I. In the nationalist telling, Hungary unjustly lost 2/3 of this land at the war's end, stranding ethnic Hungarians inside other states where they became persecuted minorities. And we say in the nationalist telling there because, of course, the nations that once made up parts of Greater Hungary have a very different take on this. Romania, Croatia, Slovakia, and more see the dismemberment of the old empire as something closer to a liberation story. Still, it's certainly true that large minorities of Hungarians today do live outside Hungary. As someone who thinks in largely ethnic terms, Orban sees it as his mission to protect them. Thanks to his predilection for handing out passports, many are now Hungarian citizens, although not in Ukraine, where dual citizenship is banned. The problem is that this has left some neighbors worrying about iridescent Hungarian claims on their territory. When such a neighbor is already fighting iridescent Russian claims in its east, well, you can see how things might go wrong. The issues really began in 2017 when Kyiv passed a law that made studying in minority languages exceedingly difficult. With up to 100,000 Hungarians living in Transcarpathia, the law naturally riled Budapest. A few years later, it was compounded by further laws that have all but banned communicating with the authorities in any language other than Ukrainian. As The Economist reported in a piece on ethnic Hungarians in Transcarpathia, quote, Sandor Spenek, the dean of the Ukrainian-Hungarian Educational Institute at Uzhhorod University, has concluded that the Ukrainian authorities want us to assimilate or leave. Well, to be fair to Kyiv, pressure from the EU has resulted in these stricter laws getting watered down. Late last year, a new law guaranteed the rights of those from EU nationalities, which would include ethnic Hungarians, to study and communicate in their own language. Still, the damage had already been done, and it's been made worse by Budapest exaggerating the problem for political effect. Take the case of Tamás Menzer, a senior official in Hungary's foreign ministry. Back in January last year, Menzer made the incendiary accusation that Ukraine was committing, quote, atrocities against its Hungarian minority. It was only later that the truth emerged. Per The Economist, he was, it turns out, referring to the removal by police of Hungarian flags from some municipal buildings near the town of Mukachevo. Now, there are few sane worlds where flags being taken down qualify for the word atrocity. Still, The incident gives us a general sense of just how far the relationship between Kiev and Budapest has deteriorated, a deterioration that's likely been further fueled by Orban's fractious relationship with Volodymyr Zelensky. Alone among EU leaders, Viktor Orban seems to have a deep personal grudge against the Ukrainian president. Even the tiny handful of others who are sympathetic to Russia, such as Robert Fico of Slovakia, don't seem so driven by personal animosity. Exactly what powers this epic grudge holding is unknown, although people have made some suggestions. Some see it as a manifestation of Orban's belief that Ukraine will never win the war, and trying to keep it in the game by loaning money and weapons is just a waste of everybody's time. Others see it as part of his belief that the EU and Russia require buffer states between them, basically a return to the status quo pre-2014 when Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova were all independent and non-aligned. Finally, others just think that it's a sop to the Hungarian far right, a way of signaling that Orban supports their dreams of resurrecting Greater Hungary. Whatever the truth, the way it has played out has been less than edifying. No matter what your opinion, the blocking of urgent aid seems an extreme way to try and solve personal differences. But is it extreme enough to justify ejecting Hungary from NATO? As we said back at the start, we want to use this video as a way of exploring the growing divide between Budapest and NATO's other 30 capitals, a divide that, if kept unchecked, risks becoming an unbridgeable chasm. Thankfully, we're not there yet. So far, questions about expelling Hungary from various Western institutions remain just that, they're just questions. Things policymakers are mulling over in the back of their minds, even as they hope Orban can be convinced to play ball. And who knows? Maybe he will be. Maybe the Hungarian leader will just keep on walking on just the right side of the line, never getting too personally close to guys like Putin and Xi Jinping, never quite letting his country become the Chinese bridgehead to Europe that it threatens to be. But maybe not. It could be that as the decades roll on, Orban finally steps over that line one too many times, finally forces his allies to face up to the blackmailer in their midst. Could Hungary survive without NATO's protection? Could Europe deal with a truly rogue state sat at its heart? Well, hopefully we'll never have to find out the answer to those questions. To return to our title, right now it feels like Hungary perhaps shouldn't be expelled from NATO. How it will feel in 5 years, 3 years, or even 6 months from now, though, is anyone's guess. And it is imperative we start planning for such an eventuality ahead of time, or risk watching the entire Western alliance collapse into indecision and paralysis.